Welcome to the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast, where we explore the spirituality of the Christian child using the method of catechesis of the Good Shepherd. I am your host, Carrie Mecchi-Lozano. Today, we are continuing our Season 2 journey of exploring all things Montessori by diving into the 4 planes of development. What are they? Why are they important for us to understand as we work with the Good Shepherd and the child? Claire Paglia joins us again today to dive into this subject. You might remember Claire from last spring when she spoke to us about freedom and discipline. I hope you enjoy. Claire, welcome back to the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you back. Claire, for anyone who didn't listen to your first episode that we had together on freedom and discipline, would you briefly tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a child of the atrium. I was part of how we started the catechesis of the Good Shepherd at the church where we were. So around 4, I was able to begin and carried through to level 3, which was a wonderful experience. As an adult, I have been a Montessori guide. So I'm primary trained, and I worked with 3 to 6-year-olds for 12 years. And I'm currently homeschooling my 3 children and enjoying implementing Montessori and catechesis of the Good Shepherd. And I'm also a catechist at our church in level 1.
And you also share your homeschool journey on Instagram too, right?
I do. Yes. My account is at Home with Montessori. And so just trying to be friendly with keeping it real and how we do Montessori at home to the best of our abilities. So
yes,
it's a work in progress.
I love it. I love following your account. I have learned so much from you. And I've also, from your account, encountered other accounts that you share. And I've learned just so much. I really appreciate that. Well, I'm really glad that you are back on the podcast, especially for this episode that we are going to be talking about today. So we're going to dive into Montessori's concept of planes of development. So Claire, would you tell us a little, what are the 4 planes of development?
Sure. So there are 4 planes of development, and Montessori observed kind of these specific stages, and each stage has 6 years to it. So the first plane of development is from 0 to 6 years old. The second plane of development is from 6 to 12 years old. So those are like the elementary years. Mm-hmm. And then the third plane is 12 to 18 years old. So that's the adolescence. And then the last plane is 18 to 24 years old. And the last one is capped at 24 years because even 100 years ago during her lifetime, she knew that was around the time that the brain reached maturity. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about, is that this is the developing person and child and the spiritual aspects of the child, but then also the brain is growing and developing at the same time. So.
And then within each of these planes, there are subplanes as well.
Yes. So within each plane, like for the first plane, for example, the subphases are like 3-year increments. So 0 to 3 years, and then is a more unconscious time. You know, the child is kind of moving and growing and learning through an inner drive. It's not really external. And then the 3 to 6-year-old child, all of a sudden things become more conscious, and they're a little bit more of learning how to control the will.
Right.
But so each plane has that same concept. And so even in Montessori schools, and also in the way that we divide the atria, we have level 1 is for 3 to 6 years old, and then level 2 is 6 to 9, and then level 3 is 9 to 12. So it kind of, we try to meet those needs in those subplanes.
And is there a difference within the subplane of the first 3 years of the subplane and the second 3 years of the subplane? So like 0 to 3 versus 3 to 6 within that first plane?
Yes. So the first portion of those planes of development, especially in the first and second one, is that first part seems to be a little bit more on the unconscious side. And then they kind of grow into, there's a confidence that's built there, and an awareness that comes with the second half of those planes of development.
And is there like, I feel like I remember in my formation something about the first half of the plane, more growth, and then in the second half, it's kind of like comfort in it. Oh, that's not the right thing.
No, I think that makes sense for sure, because I mean, especially in that first plane development, it's really pronounced. With what happens in the first 3 years is incredible. It's a huge amount of growth, and then it stabilizes a little bit more in that second half from 3 to 6. And 6, the second plane of development is definitely a more stable time of growth anyways, but you see that big jump again in the third plane of development during adolescence for 12 to 15 versus 15 to 18. There's a big difference between 12 and 18 there too. So.
Yes. I mean, that's why we separate like middle school and high schoolers, because you wouldn't put a 12-year-old with an 18-year-old. No. They're just such completely different people. I mean, I barely want to put my 12-year-old with a 15-year-old.
Exactly.
So, they're just such huge amounts of growth within each of those subphases. It's amazing. So how did Montessori come up with this idea of these 4 planes of development?
So she, so much of her work, she came at the child with the perspective of a scientist. So she's really wanting to observe and see kind of what she's discovering. I think when thinking about this, I looked up, there's a lecture that she shared in 1938, which is a really interesting one. And I think Mario Montessori may have been with her during this lecture as well. But she opened it by saying, our method has been based on the fact that we may have been guided by the manifestations of children at different phases of growth. So she's really wanting to emphasize that education, it should promote life. It can be an aid to life. And so, I know in the atrium, we're trying to allow space for, we're not teaching them. We're allowing space for them to grow and develop. So I think the other really interesting metaphor that Montessori used with the planes of development is she compared it to the life cycle of a butterfly for the 4 planes. And because in essence, each plane of development is a series of rebirths. So, the butterfly begins as an egg, which hatches into a caterpillar that grows at an absolutely alarming rate until it creates a chrysalis and then blossoms into a magnificent butterfly. And so likewise, the first plane child is born and grows at an alarming rate through planes 1 and 2. And then in plane 3, for adolescence, the child who's now a teenager becomes more introspective and kind of self-searching. And then they finally reach plane 4 when they blossom into an adult that's ready to see the world. So I think really her goal was to figure out how we can best meet the needs of children, how we can understand where they are, where they're coming from, what's developmentally appropriate, and realize that there's commonalities there that can help us as adults better serve the children that we're working with.
Right. It's amazing that she was able to apply her scientific medical education and background that she had in applying to the children in this way, that she had these decades with children and observing them. And so she was able to see these specific types of growth and specific characteristics within certain children, which I think that all of us who have children in our lives, especially parents and grandparents, we notice it, but kind of subconsciously, like now when I read about the 4 planes, you're like, oh yeah, that's so this kid. And oh, that's so this kid. But I think just the busyness of being a parent, we don't sit down and analyze it. But Maria Montessori, that's the gift she gave us, is from her scientific background, she knew how to analyze what she was looking at. So she watched the children grow and was able to see things that we as parents see, but don't necessarily see. And in doing that, really aided us in how we can see, like, okay, so this child wants us to read this over and over and over. Like that's typical for this plane of development. Or this child is questioning, what's right and what's wrong. That's typical for this plane of development. Those kind of things. She was able to gift us with the explanation to what we see subconsciously as parents.
Yes.
Now, Claire, could you tell us a little bit more about each of these phases? Like, what can we see in each of these phases? What is the difference between a first plane child and a fourth plane child?
Sure. Happy to.
Huge difference.
It's a big, big difference. So that first plane child, the phrase that I keep in mind with this child is help me do it by myself.
Mm-hmm.
They really want to figure out how to be more independent. They want to learn how to do things. So during that first plane of development, the child is absorbing culture, customs, habits, values, and attitudes of the adults in their environment. And the absorbent mind, which we'll probably touch on some more in a bit, which Dr. Montessori shared as a special gift that the first plane child has, is really hard at work taking everything in the environment without a filter, kind of like the viewfinder in a camera. You can't really choose. I mean, you can, when you have your camera looking at something, you can't really be like, well, I don't really want that tree that's in the middle to be part of it. It's just,
it's all there.
They take it all in.
Yes.
But the first plane child learns actively through movement. And so we really try to allow for that in the atrium. We want to allow space for them to move and space for them to choose where to work, with whom to work. But this phase of development really has incredible physical and psychological growth. I mean, we go from a newborn that is not able to do anything for herself to a 6-year-old that can walk, talk, move, make decisions, all of those things. But the growth during this time really sets the foundation for the development in the planes to come. It's the largest amount of growth of any of the planes of development. The second plane, the phrase that I use for this plane is help me to think for myself. Because the second plane child during those elementary years has become increasingly more independent. They're definitely interested in friends and peers. Sometimes they're called the herd children, HERD. So they're like, they want to be in groups and work collaboratively. And really children of this stage have really brilliant imagination. They have a sense of justice. They're really concerned about figuring out what's right, what's wrong. They'll ask you questions, why questions. The first plane child might say, what is that? What is this? What is, but the second plane child is really wanting to know why. They want to know.
Right.
And so much to the point that, I find at home I have one child that's solidly in the second plane and another one that's heading that direction. So often I'm having to say, let's look it up together because I don't always know all of the answers for all of these things.
That's a really humble response though, because then it teaches the child that you don't get to adulthood and know it all.
Yes.
And you're also indirectly teaching them. Yeah. And you're indirectly teaching them how to find the answers.
Yes.
Because you're doing that too. Oh, I definitely have a second plane child too. He does so much better if you explain the why. Like if you just say, okay, you need to go over there, it doesn't work. But if you explain why he needs to go over there, he's like, oh, okay, I'll go over there.
And my oldest definitely needs to know the
why.
This is, I know you don't want me to do that, but why don't you want me to do that? This is why this is unsafe.
And then I will decide for myself that's a just reason why.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly.
So the other thing that's interesting about the second plane is that they tend to collect items. So the first plane child is usually really focused on order. They're really particular about where things go. But the second plane child, that all goes out the window. So it is normal for a second plane child to have a collection or collections of things. Their rooms are they don't tend to be tidy. It's a pretty stark contrast from the first plane. And they're definitely interested in culture and the world. And so we kind of talk about offering the child the world and really thinking about that, not saying let's give them everything, but they want to learn more about Greek mythology. Okay, let's see how many different ways we can come at that, or whatever it might be.
Right.
And they're also really trying to move from concrete thinking to abstract thinking. So that's the first plane child is definitely very concrete, but the second plane child becomes more abstract, and they really want to explore. They're just on the go. So the third plane, which is 12 to 18 years, that's the phrasing I use with that one is to help me stand on my own. The third plane of development is again marked by incredible growth. It kind of mirrors the growth that happens during the first plane of development, because the adolescent is becoming the adult, right? So
yes, yeah.
it's a huge amount of growth. The adolescent also has emotional vulnerability. They really want to establish their own values. They tend to want to benefit humanity, so they may want to do. They're more interested in, outreach or ways to serve the community.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they also tend to face more pressure from peers and school. And they're really trying to answer that question, though, who am I? Really want to try to figure that out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think they're really mostly determining, though, what's my relationship with society, and this child also still needs a hands-on learning environment. And I think that often our mindset is, well, they're older, they can just learn from books, but they really still need that hands-on element.
Yeah.
Which is often, it kind of comes in with being able to go out and whether it's serve the community or maybe have like a little internship or just something that's kind of helping them figure out their place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the final plane of development, there's really not as much about this one because Montessori spent so much time during her life working on the first and second planes. But for the fourth plane, which is 18 to 24 years, the phrase that I use here is help me find my life's work. So this final plane of development has stable growth, and the young adult now has physical and psychological maturity. They really desire to work to make their dreams a reality and often have a distinct moral conscience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The young adult is also mentally preparing for how to accomplish the steps to begin their life's work. So whether, there's so many different ways to do that. But hopefully, our hope is by the end of the fourth plane that this individual is able to stand strong with their own beliefs and values and know their place.
Yeah. Yeah, I've worked a lot with young adults, and I see a lot of what you're describing, this idea of trying to find your life's work. And when we say work, we don't mean job.
No.
It's more work of your hands, the work that's going to give you internal satisfaction, whether that brings in money or not. And then also a huge, huge moral compass of wanting to put their imprint on the world in a positive way. How can I make this world a better place? I feel like is a huge part of that moral growth, moral feelings that this aged person has.
Definitely.
Yeah. So within each of these phases, as you're talking about the growth that happens within the phase, but then also as you move on to another phase, can you describe, like, we're not just talking about mental growth. Can you describe the different types of growth that we're talking about?
So there's the very obvious physical growth. I mean, you can see that as you watch a child move through each plane of development. There's also the psychological growth and the growth of the brain and then socially, how they're interacting with others. That first plane child tends to do a lot of individual or parallel play, but then when they get into the second plane, they're really into collaborative play. Like let's get together, let's figure this out. So I think it's not just trying to see these little bits and pieces here and there. It's really trying to pull all of it together and see how this child is growing as a whole.
Right. And Anna Hurdle spoke about a little bit back in a previous podcast about the second plane child, but that a child can develop in each of these things, physical, social, spiritual, emotional, mental, all these things, at different rates.
Yes.
So, like, for example, I have a child in my level 1 atrium right now who socially is very much like a second plane child. He is very much ready to just socialize and collaborate with his peers. But in other aspects, he's not quite a second plane child yet. And so it's very normal for children to kind of develop those things at different rates and different from their peers as well. And that's okay.
Definitely. That's definitely, yes. I've seen that so many times, especially in my Montessori environment, when children would start to get ready to transition to elementary, you kind of see those little glimmers of, oh, that's a little second plane characteristic. That's a second plane characteristic. But
Yeah.
just because we see that first characteristic doesn't mean they need to jump to the next level.
Right.
It's just those little things that are starting to build and pull together. And the child does start to gradually detach from the environment that they're in. If they're in that level 1 environment, they start to, move a little bit away, and they're starting to be ready to transition. But it doesn't mean we move them immediately.
Right. You just might treat that child a little differently. For example, you might make them a little bit more of a leader, or give them some more of the materials that a developing second plane child or a moving into a second plane child might be interested in, such as like tracing, or maybe some of the harder work, such as like liturgical calendar, or, Eucharistic presence, things that like a child that can move outside of time and space might be more interested in, such as Eucharistic presence, maybe.
Definitely. And I think sometimes they dive more into the geography work too.
Yeah.
They really want to know more about, okay, Jesus was a real person, in time, a long time ago, but they really want to understand that more. And then that starts to spur, some really interesting conversations as well.
Right. Yeah, or making little labels for them as they're becoming early readers. Those kind of things might be for that child. But like you said before, it doesn't mean that they're ready to necessarily be in the level 2 atrium. And I think that you and I were speaking about this before we started recording, about we have a tendency as adults to kind of think of this as accomplishment from moving from one plane to the other. And we have to be very careful about that.
Definitely. Yeah, we're not looking for an achievement of like, okay, congratulations, you have signs of the second plane. We're really trying.
You graduated to level 2. That's not what it is.
It's not what it is at all. No.
And in some ways, a level 1 child, we do not want to rush them out of that plane. It is that beautiful, like you said, the absorbent mind, and a very unique time in their life that they're never going to get back. That we do not want to move them fast and with this accomplishment mentality of, yes, my child's now a level 2 child and your child's still a level 1 child, or whatever it is. Allowing our child to sit in where they're at rather than push them forward.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Claire, would you speak into that absorbent mind that we see in that first plane? How is that first plane distinguishable from the other planes? Why is it so important and different?
Sure. So the first plane, is marked by such incredible growth. And the only other plane that really comes close to that amount of growth is that third plane, like I mentioned before, where the child goes through adolescence. But I think the first plane child has this special gift that Montessori talked about, which is the absorbent mind. And it's subconscious though. And so we really aren't often always aware of how, even in the atrium, the Good Shepherd is working in the young child. And it really, I heard Marty O'Brien say this the other day, that it contributes to the mystery of really what we're working with, and really propels our desire to allow space for the Holy Spirit to work in the atrium. Montessori talked about 2 words that go with the absorbent mind. One is called horme, which is referring to the inner drive, that the subconscious inner drive that just propels them to, with most infants, you don't have to say, okay, now it's time to roll over. They just do it. Right. They know that, they do it on their own time, and we don't rush that. But it's the same thing with the steps to learning to walk. They know kind of when it's time, or when they've built enough strength to start to move their bodies in that way. And then the other word that she used is called neme, and it's really the power of retention. So it's this idea that the child is taking in everything, and it becomes part of the fabric of their being. And that is both amazing and scary at the same time, just to think about how powerful that is. But the characteristics that go with the absorbent mind is creative, it's unconscious or involuntary, it's universal, it's non-discriminatory, and it's global. And the other word that they put with that is instantaneous. So I think that those are really interesting. It's a lot to unpack there, but there was a quote I found from Montessori that I think really helps to sum up kind of the first plane child and this growth and the absorbent mind. And it's from the book, The Absorbent Mind. And she said that the child has a different relation to his environment from ours. So adults admire the environment. They can remember it and think about it, but the child absorbs it. The things he sees are not just remembered, they form a part of his soul. He incarnates himself all in the world about him, that his eyes see and his ears hear. In us, the same things produce no change, but the child is transformed by them. So this is a vital kind of memory, which does not consciously remember, but absorbs images into the individual's very life. And this is, she was referring to Neme there. It has a special name. Just the fact that this child can learn everything without knowing it, it's really incredible.
It is amazing. They just absorb it. It makes me think of like a blank canvas.
Yes.
And everything, like, sometimes when you paint, it's layers of paint, but that when it's blank, it has the biggest impact. All of that, those first layers, it just absorbs it all. And then that's what I think about with that very young child. And it is very intimidating. I think we both have an almost 2-year-old. And I think about this absorbent mind a lot with him. Like I'm sitting there, maybe I'm laying down with him to go to sleep, to get him to sleep. And I'm sitting there playing on my phone or something. And I'm thinking, okay, what is he absorbing right now? Like it's really intimidating, this absorbent mind, or the order in our house, or my emotions, or our family's emotions, or our family's busyness. All of these things can be really intimidating for this absorbent mind that is sitting right before me.
Yes.
But I also think that one of the biggest things that he's absorbing at his age, this little 2-year-old, or almost 2-year-old, is the emotions. So is he feeling loved? Does he feel secure in that love? Does he feel secure in this space? And you think about children in like mass orphanages and stuff, and they're getting fed, they're getting changed, they're getting bathed, but they're not getting very much interaction. And the huge impact that has on their whole life. You hear about these stories of children and being abused or neglected in those first few years, and what an impact that has on their whole life in that first subplane, that for 0 to 3 years old.
Yes.
And how what they absorbed, the lack of love, the lack of attention, the lack of I am important, had the effect that has on their whole life. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
It really is. And there's so much more research now to support the value of holding space for emotions and identifying emotions.
Yes.
I mean, that was not something, I think even when we were children, that was, that was such an important thing, but now they're realizing this is actually very important, for us, our society as a whole. The other thing I've been learning more about is felt experiences. And I think that really applies to the first plane child because it's subconscious. And so they may not have the words for what they've experienced, but they have the feeling that's there. And so I think that that's an interesting, the older that children get, the more they can put the words to it. But for that first plane child, it is subconscious. And so it's just taken on as a feeling.
So a felt experience is like, they're not going to remember what we did this day, but they're going to remember how they felt. Is that what you mean?
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, obviously it depends on the intensity of the experience, but
right, of course, sure.
For felt experiences, I think it's a newer thing that I hadn't realized was a reality, right? But it makes sense the more we think about the absorbent mind and the more we think about how subconscious growth is during that time.
No, I think that's huge. I think that if we all look back at our own personal history, like the things in our life that we remember are the things that had really strong feelings around it. And especially for the young children, I think that is like how they felt about God or in a space that represents God, like the atrium or the church, how those places made them feel is what that 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old is going to remember. So I think that that's one of the reasons why the atrium is such a beautiful place for the spiritual growth of the child, because what they remember is love and peace.
Yes.
Like they walk in there and they're like, I feel peaceful. I feel loved. I feel safe. And those feelings they wrap around the Good Shepherd because that's what they associate with it. And I think that as adults who care about the spiritual growth of children, considering that felt experience is very important. So how are we making the children feel when they walk in our church? How are we making the children feel when they do anything on our church grounds? How are we making the children feel when we pray together at home? Is it like this stressful experience for all of us where we walk away going, why do we even try to do that? Or is it a positive experience? Even though they were rolling on the ground, they have a positive felt experience from it. When we're dealing with children in this first plane, 0 to 6 years old, I feel like that is what's most important for us to remember is how is this experience making them feel?
Yes.
Because that's what they are going to remember.
Definitely. And knowing that those times, even if they're rolling around on the floor, that absorbent mind is still taking it in.
Exactly.
I feel like I've encountered that more with homeschooling and I had it in my classroom too, and even sometimes in the atrium, but there'd be times that sometimes children are just rolling on the floor and I'm like, this is so, but then I'm realizing I'm like, it's okay. They're taking it in, they need to move. We've got to allow space for that. And it's developmentally appropriate, but it's definitely tricky though, because we have, as the adults, we have our own, experiences and feelings and perspective that we're bringing to the situation. And I think that the planes of development really kind of help us to take that step back and help us to practice the pause a little bit to realize like, okay, this is something that really should be happening during the second plane of development, or, the rude, the brutally honest comment that I just got from my second plane child is completely normal. This is okay.
Right. And I think you're touching there on the why, like the why are the planes of development important for us for in the atrium or in our spiritual growth with children. It's so that we can understand them and be able to minister to their specific needs better by understanding who they are as this first plane child, as this second plane child, as this third plane child. Who are they so that we can maybe adapt our own expectations to where they really are.
I think it also helps us to see more joy in each plane of development. I think it takes out, the longer I've been doing this, the more I feel like that it takes out some of the irritation or annoyance when something, you get that brutally honest comment and you're like, oh, that got me a little bit, but it's like, this is supposed to happen. Like they're doing what they're supposed to be doing at the second plane. And it's, or in the first plane when they're like running circles in the house, you're like, why are we running again? Or whatever it might be. But I think it helps to take some of the wind out of that and see, okay, this is supposed to be happening. This is, and it allows us to experience that joy and be able to be with the children instead of, I think that it helps us to attune. And I think that attunement is so crucial to be able to best meet their needs and work with them.
Yeah. And I think that it also allows us to grow in respect for the child as a person. If we kind of put on these Montessori glasses, per se, of observing the child, of who they are today, because it changes every single day, and respect that person that's standing in front of us, this 3-year-old, this 6-year-old, this 10-year-old, whatever, respect who they are in this moment. And I just feel like that respect for the child as a full human being is one of the best gifts that Montessori has given us.
Absolutely. And I think helping us to be present in that moment is so key as well. I think so often we're like, oh, I can't wait until they do this, or I can't wait until this happens. And to really just pull back and say, where are we now? How are we meeting seeing this whole child right now.
The other thing is, when I look at the planes of development, it makes me think about the Bible verse of Jesus saying, unless you become like little children, you will not be able to enter the kingdom of heaven. I'm not quoting it directly, but it makes me, that scripture verse makes me think about that first plane child and how you were saying how they're instinctual, but then they're also so absorbent, and they're also just so essential, like they're just so beautiful. Like, yeah, God loves me. No questions asked. Got it. And Jesus is saying, okay, see this first plane child, this 0 to 6-year-old, become like them. Go hang out with them because they have something to teach you, which I think is why Maria and Sophia and Gianna, they all spent so much time with that first plane child, because Jesus was pointing to them saying, okay, guys, that's where the answers are.
Yes.
It's right here with these 0 to 6-year-olds. So go see what they have to teach you about me.
Absolutely.
Well, where can we dive into?
Yes.
If we want to learn more about the 4 planes, where can we find them?
So I'm going to have to see if I can find this so that we can be able to share it. But there's a 1938 lecture by Maria Montessori that really covers a lot with the 4 planes of development. The book, The Absorbent Mind, also has a chapter that's totally focused on planes of development.
Which chapter is it? Chapter 3?
It's chapter 3. And I'm hoping that it will be the same in everybody else's book too, but it's a different, there's so many different publishers.
Right. Look for the chapter on planes of development.
Yeah. There's also In Education for a New World by, that one has another chapter. It's also chapter 3. And then From Childhood to Adolescence, that book is obviously packed with amazingness for all planes of development. But the first chapter especially is really key.
And then a much shorter chapter, Listening to God with Children, Gianna Gobi.
Yes.
Let's see, which chapter is this? This is chapter 9, the 4 planes of development in education.
Yes.
Yes. Beautiful. Well, wonderful. Well, Claire, can you tell all of our listeners where they can find you?
Sure. You can follow me over on Instagram. My account is called At Home with Montessori, and we share about our life there. And so that's probably the best place. But
yeah. Well, great. Well, Claire, thank you so much for joining us again and for sharing your wisdom with us. We really appreciate you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you all for listening. I hope that you have a deeper understanding of Montessori's 4 planes of development. There are a few other episodes that I would like to recommend for you to go back and listen to again that go really well along with this Montessori series that we're doing, but very specifically with this episode on the 4 planes of development. Of course, go back and listen to Claire's first episode with us, episode 30 on freedom and discipline. But also go check out episode 41 with Anna Hurdle, where she speaks specifically about that second plane child, that 6 to 12-year-old, and the characteristics of that child. And also, if you go to episode 4, we talk about Montessori's concept of normalization with Gabriela Perez. We would like to invite all of you to help us spread the word about this podcast. Do you know anybody who would be interested in learning more about Catechesis of the Good Shepherd or about Montessori? Share these episodes with them. Help us get the word out so that more people can know about this beautiful work that we are doing. I have some links to some books and also some websites that you might want to explore if you're interested in diving into this topic of Montessori more. Check out those links in our show notes. Also, remember that CGS USA publishes a journal every year, and this year's journal is all about Montessori. So there will be a link in our show notes to how you can get your hands on that journal if you haven't already got it. If you are a member of the United States Association of Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, you should have already received your journal for this year in the mail. The United States Association of Catechesis of the Good Shepherd is currently doing our annual appeal. Through the joy, the wonder, and awe, and their capacity for love and prayer and radical simplicity, children offer us a glimpse of what it means to fall in love with God. And this has been the work of CGS USA for almost 40 years to advocate for the child's joy. Each year, CGS USA provides formation courses, publishes new books for continuing study and contemplation, and continues to support catechists and religious leaders across the nation and the world in helping children find their own path to God's love. So we are humbly asking you for your continued help and support in this effort, and to please give generously to our annual appeal. This podcast is sponsored by the United States Association of Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. We would like to thank all the contributing members because you are making this podcast possible. If you would like to know more about Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, or if you would like to become a member, please go to cgsusa.org. Thank you all for listening this week. We will see you in 2 weeks. Go and fall more deeply in love with God.